Hello and welcome to the Dailyaus. I'm Zara Seidler.
I'm Emma Gillespie.
Well, Em, we are officially at the pointy end of the election campaign.
Wowie.
I don't know how many times I'm going to say that this week, but hey, we're here. In a matter of days, we're going to know which party has formed government and who the next leader of Australia will be. And so on today's episode, I thought it would be helpful to give a bit of a lowdown on who the two people vying for the top job actually are. You've heard their names many times before, Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton. From their time before Parliament to what they've pushed for inside of Canberra, we're going to take you through everything you need to know before the weekend.
All right, Zara, I think this is going to be a really helpful one for a lot of listeners today. Before we explain who the two leaders are, I think we should talk through the fact that these are not names that are necessarily going to appear on the ballots of most people's voting cards this weekend. There's an important difference between who the potential future leader is versus who we vote for on ballot day.
Yeah, exactly. So I do think this is a good place to start because I think sometimes we look at the US and we think that we do things very similarly, but when it comes to voting, it's very, very different. So when we go to vote here in Australia, as you just said, unless you live in two electorates, Grayndler in Sydney or Dixon in Queensland, you're not actually directly voting for Anthony Albanese or Peter Dutton. Instead, you're voting for who you want to send to Canberra to represent your local electorate. So, for example, if you're in the seat of Wannon, say in Victoria, you're going to vote for who you believe should represent Wannon in Parliament. That's not going to be Anthony Albanese and that's not going to be Peter Dutton. You're going to have a choice between a Liberal candidate, so that seat's currently held by a Liberal candidate, Dan Tehan, exactly, but he's being challenged by a bunch of other candidates. For example, an independent candidate in Alex Dyson, a Labor candidate, a Greens candidate. I won't keep saying the word candidate. You understand what I'm saying there.
And if the name Alex Dyson sounds familiar to you, that's because he is a former Triple J presenter.
He is. So he has decided to make the venture into independent politics. And so that was just an example of one of the seats and some of the names that you might see. And so, as we've spoken about on this podcast before, the way that government is formed is that whichever of the major parties reach 76 seats of the available 150 seats in the House, that's the party that forms government. And so the leader of that party then goes on to become the Prime Minister.
So while not every ballot will have Anthony Albanese or Peter Dutton's name on it, there will be representatives of the major parties on those ballots.
Exactly.
Okay, gotcha. So now that we understand how the House of Reps forms government and how a leader becomes Prime Minister, let's talk about those two leadership options. We have Anthony Albanese, who is, of course, the current sitting Prime Minister, the leader of the Labor Party, and Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, the Liberal Party leader. Let's start with Anthony Albanese first. Simple question, Zara, but I'm sure a complex answer. Who is Albo?
Yeah, look, small question there. But as you said, Anthony Albanese has been our Prime Minister since he won the 2022 federal election. But he is by no means a new face when it comes to politics. So if we start way back at the beginning of the Anthony Albanese story, he was born in Sydney in 1963, so that makes him 62. As he regularly discusses and as has informed a lot of his politics, Albanese was raised by his single mother in public housing. When he was born, he understood his father to have passed away. He found out later in life that that was not the case, and there are lots of kind of podcasts and stories about meeting his father later in life, but we'll leave that for a separate discussion. Anthony Albanese was the first person in his family to finish school and then the first to attend university. He ended up completing a Bachelor of Economics at the University of Sydney, and he became involved with the Labor Party very early on. He actually joined the party while he was still at school.
Wow.
So he is, like, when you talk about lifelong party members, that is Anthony Albanese.
This is a career Labor man.
Seriously. And I mean, he's also a career politician, basically. Yeah. So he left university and went on to work in the party. He worked as a research officer, as a party official, and then he worked as a staffer or an advisor to Bob Carr, who was a former premier. And that was all before he decided that it was time to run for the seat of Grayndler, so his own seat in Parliament. In 1996, so before I was born, that's how long he's been in Parliament, Anthony Albanese was elected as the federal member for Grayndler. And at the time, which is interesting, he was elected as the youngest member of Parliament.
That is fascinating. I think a lot of people don't realise how long he's been there, nearly 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, both of them have been there for ages. Yep. So I was looking back at his first speech. We used to call them maiden speeches, but that term's kind of been thrown out a bit now.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, we refer to them. Yeah, we'll just refer to it as his first speech. And I think that first speeches are a really helpful way of understanding why someone goes into politics in the first place, like what's really driving them, what they want to achieve.
They often act as a bit of an opportunity for that person to tell the country what they stand for, what motivated them to want to be in public service. So there's a lot you can learn from someone from that address.
Definitely. And I mean, it's crazy to think that it was decades ago now, but I'll read a little bit of it. Anthony Albanese said on the floor of the Parliament, "I will be satisfied if I can be remembered as someone who will stand up for the interests of my electorate, for working class people, for the Labour movement, and for our progressive advancement as a nation into the next century." Of course, he was speaking in the last century.
Very 90s jargon.
Yeah. And so during his very long career in Parliament, Albanese has held a number of portfolios and shadow portfolios. So he became a senior minister during the Rudd and Gillard years. He served as the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport and then later as Deputy Prime Minister under Kevin Rudd. But then Labor lost power and the coalition won successive elections. And so Labor wasn't in power for nearly a decade. And so during that time, Anthony Albanese was understood to kind of been working up the ranks. And when Labor lost the 2019 election, which was a big shock, if people remember.
When Bill Shorten lost to Scott Morrison.
Exactly. And no one was expecting it. And so when Labor lost, Bill Shorten stepped down. And that is when Anthony Albanese became the leader of the Labor Party. And we all know he went on to lead the party to victory at the 2022 election. And at that election, kind of similar to a first speech in Parliament, it's interesting to look back at what the priorities he set out in his first speech or his victory speech after becoming Prime Minister was. Because it's like kind of different to what we're talking about this election.
It's incredibly different. And I think the big standout moment from that speech that many of us will remember is the referendum.
Exactly. So Anthony Albanese got up and basically the first sentence almost out of his mouth was that he was going to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. Since that time, we've gone to a referendum that failed, but that was certainly one of the big policy promises from the Albanese government at that time. His basic premise his basic promise, I guess, to the electorate was no one held back and no one left behind. So that set out a bit of what Anthony Albanese wanted to do with his 3 years in power. He wanted to take significant action on climate change, and he wanted to, in his own words, build an economy that works for people and not the other way around. Obviously needs to be said that a lot has changed in those 3 years, a lot of external factors, also a lot of internal domestic matters that have shifted since. And so this time around, we are looking, as we've spoken on podcasts this week, at quite different policy platforms than the last time around.
Yeah, and of course the mood is very different to 2022 when we were coming out of COVID, out of the pandemic, in that recovery phase. There was that sort of sense of uncertainty or disbelief of, is it really over? Are we really moving on now? And then, of course, the cost of living crisis in the meantime has well and truly set in, and that's dominated the campaigning on both sides of this election. It is really interesting, though, to hear those focuses of Albanese's career from, 1996 right through to the last election. He did beat Scott Morrison in 2022. And after Morrison lost, Peter Dutton became the Liberal Party's leader. So he has been leading the opposition since 2022. What do we need to know about Dutton?
Hi, I'm Zara. I'm the co-founder of thedailyaus, and we started this company because we think news can be done differently. If you agree, you can hit subscribe. It's the best way to help us grow. Now, back to the video. Okay, so Peter Dutton was born in 1970 in Brisbane, and similar to Albanese, Peter Dutton became politically involved at a really early age. So he joined the Young Liberals at the sprightly age of 18. It was only a year later, at the age of 19, that Peter Dutton first ran for Parliament.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was not even thinking about Parliament when I was 19.
I know. We were very different 19-year-olds. But clearly both of the choices for leader have long had these political aspirations. It wasn't something that came to them later in life, but rather certainly fostered early on. So Dutton ran for Parliament at the age of 19. He contested a state seat. So he contested a seat in the 1989 Queensland state election, but that was a safe Labor seat and he ended up losing. And so when he was unsuccessful at that election, he kind of pivoted a bit. He went on to study a Bachelor of Business, but then he went part-time to study when he joined the police force.
Okay.
And I'd say as much as Anthony Albanese's narrative revolves around his childhood and growing up with a single mother in public housing.
The working class boy from Marrickville.
Exactly. That narrative has been very strong, and the narrative of Peter Dutton and his experiences as a policeman, I'd say, are equally as strong and inform a number of his policies.
I think if listeners don't know a lot about Peter Dutton, what they do know is that he was a cop once.
Yeah, exactly. So he served as a Queensland police officer for just under a decade, so for 9 years. During that time, he worked in a drug squad in Brisbane, and then he worked later with the sex offenders squad. And I think it's probably that latter experience that has come to the fore a lot. He often talks about the unspeakable things that he saw during his time in the police force and how that drives him to want to protect specifically women and girls. Peter Dutton ended up leaving the police force in 1999. He was at that point a detective senior constable, but he departed the police force. He then went on to join his father's business that was around like kind of converting property into childcare facilities. So he worked in that for a bit. But then in 2001, his political aspirations came swinging back and Peter Dutton contested the seat of Dixon in Queensland and he won, starting his parliamentary career at the turn of the century.
Interesting that both Dutton and Albanese had dabbled in state politics or started around state politics. But
or advising, yeah.
Yeah, advising. And then their first big political gigs were on the federal stage.
Yeah, it is really interesting, and I think goes to a kind of class of people who have spent a long time in and around politics.
Yeah.
I think there are kind of two categories of politicians, those that had very different careers and those that have kind of always been aligned with party politics. And so I just want to go back to Dutton really quickly because, like we spoke about Anthony Albanese's first speech to Parliament, Dutton's was equally telling about his priorities and what was really driving him at the time. And he highlighted how his work as a policeman had shaped his worldview. He said, and I quote, "I often say to people that as a police officer, I've seen the best and the worst that society has to offer. I've seen the wonderful, kind nature of people willing to offer any assistance to those in their worst hour. And I've seen the sickening behavior displayed by people who, frankly, barely justify their existence in our sometimes over-tolerant society." In that same speech, he went on to say, "To me, the Liberal Party was a party founded in many ways on the principles of individualism and reward for achievement. It goes without saying, of course, that these are principles from which I have benefited and always defended with great conviction." And I think that that was a really interesting quote to pull out because there's so much talk in the kind of political sphere about what type of Liberal Dutton is and whether Anthony Albanese is the right type of Labor man. But these sorts of quotes really go to the heart of how they interpret their party's values. And so for Peter Dutton, we're talking here about small government, we're talking about the free market, and that is clearly what he believes to be the way the country should be run.
I was going to say the rhetoric of both of their first speeches in Parliament, you know, even though we're talking about the late 90s and 2001, these quotes could be them today really. So as much as the world around them has changed and they have changed, their kind of moral compass or their political focus hasn't really shifted that far away. None of these quotes are that surprising.
No, not at all. And I'll just really quickly jump through the rest of Dutton's parliamentary career. So he held key government positions throughout the kind of last decade or so. He was Home Affairs Minister. I think that's probably where people first became familiar, or at least kind of on a national stage, with Peter Dutton.
That was during a heightened period of illegal immigration, the Stop the Boats era.
Yeah, exactly. And so he became the face, really, of border security, and then later with Scott Morrison. Peter Dutton, alongside being Home Affairs Minister, was at one point also the Minister for Health, the Minister for Sport, and the Minister for Defence. So he's really tried his hand at a lot of different portfolios there. Prior to winning the leadership in 2022, Dutton had contested the leadership of the Liberal Party before, but he hadn't been successful. So people might remember during the Turnbull years, there was a time where there was a bit of unrest in the party, we'll put it that way.
Delicately put, Zara.
Thank you. And Peter Dutton put his name forward, or put his hand up to run during a leadership spill. He wasn't successful at that time. Scott Morrison went on to become Prime Minister, but then when Scott Morrison lost the election, Peter Dutton was elected as leader unopposed. And so that brings us to today. He's hoping to win the election and to become the next Prime Minister of Australia.
Okay, so we've got these two mainstays of the Australian political landscape with quite different stories, but there's also a lot in common there. They've both spent time as leader of the opposition.
Yeah.
They've both been in federal parliament for decades, and they're both vying for the same job. But before we go on, Zara, regardless of who wins, it will be a big deal. Whatever the result is on Saturday, it's going to be a significant one.
Yeah.
Can you just explain why?
Yeah. So if Peter Dutton pulls off a victory this weekend and becomes Prime Minister, he will become the first opposition leader to unseat a first-term government since 1929.
That's nearly 100 years.
So many years. So let me just unpack that. So Anthony Albanese was elected last election. His government, the Labor government, has served one term so far. If Dutton is able to win on Saturday, that will mean that Labor doesn't get a second term, and that it's the first time that that's happened since 1929.
This is kind of a trend that we see throughout polling all around the world, that the incumbent government, as in the government that's serving at the time of the election, voters anecdotally will favour what they know, the kind of rhetoric of, if people are apathetic, they might think, oh, well, better the devil you know.
Yeah, it's been such an interesting time in global politics, because for a long time that was believed to be the case, and incumbents did have this kind of advantage. But then last year we saw a bunch of incumbents, and specifically kind of moderate or progressive incumbents, all lose in a row. But then we had the Canadian election just a couple of days ago, where the incumbent government was once again restored. And so there is a lot of chatter out there about whether or not the US election has actually flipped that.
Yeah.
And that perhaps we are now going to go back to, as you said, that incumbency advantage. I've just said the word incumbency like 15 times in one sentence.
But to the heart of what you're saying is that, I guess, trends have changed.
Yeah.
But more than ever this year, we find ourselves in more uncharted territory
basically
with the
no
US
one knows.
climate. Basically, no one knows.
Trends are changing, and anyone that knows a trend is making it up. But just on the idea of the kind of historic moment that we're in, it's not just going to be historic if Peter Dutton is successful. If Anthony Albanese is successful, he will become the first Prime Minister to win 2 elections in a row since John Howard in 2004.
These two facts, these two stats are bonkers, because we're saying that a first-term government hasn't lost its crack at a second term in nearly 100 years, but a leader of a party hasn't led as Prime Minister for 2 terms since 2004.
And that is, of course, because we have had so many changes in leadership. Since that all happened, it has become a lot harder to unseat a leader. Those leadership spills, you might have noticed, haven't happened for a little bit. That's because both parties have said, like, enough. We must not have this again. So it is harder. But that means that, for the last 20 odd years, that's been the case. And so if Anthony Albanese wins, he's going to be the first one to do it kind of double whammy since John Howard.
Whatever happens, it's history in the making.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about it no matter what.
It's exciting. I'm sure there's, a lot of fatigue setting in for people out there.
Push through. There's only a couple of days left.
Every corner you turn, every page that you scroll past, every TV ad you see, it's
every
a lot.
Text message you receive in an unsolicited sense.
And wonder where on earth did they get my number. But it's exciting to have these little tidbits to kind of look forward to, and remembering the kind of historical moments that come with any kind of democratic election.
Exactly. Couldn't have put it better, Em.
Zara, thank you so much for taking us through that. It was really, really helpful and interesting.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us for another episode of The Daily Oz. We've got one more day of the working week before the election. Make sure you are sending any friend who's saying, I'm not political, these podcasts, because everyone needs to vote and therefore they need to be informed. We'll be back later today with the headlines, but until then, have a great day.